Hello, everybody. Hello, hello. Thank you for joining us. The Climate Resilient Maricopa Regional Infrastructure Exchange. This is our third workshop we've been putting on. My name is Brianne Fisher. I'm the Climate Action Manager for the City of Tempe. My boss, Dr. Braden Kay, is been the director at the City of Tempe for 5 years now. And when I first started, he wanted me to work on mobilizing and getting some collective thought around the federal infrastructure funding that is coming down. We all know in our individual fields that a lot of the issues that we are talking about that will make an impact to mitigating extreme heat, to mitigating climate change are not specific to individual cities. They are indeed regional efforts. And so there's a really great opportunity to use the federal funding to show our regional collaboration and find areas of prioritization amongst all of us, find projects that we think are valuable, that bring in the community, that move the needle on some resilience to our communities. And that's really why we're here today. So again, this is the third workshop that we've been having. The opportunity is with the federal funding coming down, and using that federal funding to organize ourselves, discover projects, discover priorities that we believe can bring some federal funding home and make a real difference into our communities. And so using that federal funding to then the long-term goal and future is how do we continue this mobilization for 10, 15, 20 years down the road? We have some examples you'll see on the slide here. San Diego, Annapolis, they have long-standing bodies, governance bodies and organization that are around planning for resilience. We have some examples of that. For instance, we have the GPECs of the world, which is a regional economic council. We have MAG, which is a regional transportation planning council. But the question and the thought long term is do we need one for resiliency infrastructure? And what does that look like? And what could that be? And so using this funding opportunity with the federal government to just start to think about what that long-term future could be of a collective regional organization around resilience. But I think it's important to have that long-term vision in mind, but really focus in on the opportunity we have at hand. If you have not been part of our last two workshops, we have gone, what we typically do is we've identified a couple of the funding buckets out of the whole infrastructure plan that we believe we are primed to take advantage of. And that criteria was really about where is there already energy and capacity at. As we all know, and some of you guys are part of, these existing collective efforts, for instance, Sustainable Cities Network, the Urban Forestry Roundtable, the Rio Reimagined. There's already very good examples of regional collaboration. And so taking advantage of some of that and having conversations about how to scale that to potentially be a joint application is kind of the conversations we've been having in the last two workshops. And one of them is around the ecosystems restoration. That is a specific funding bucket. And some of the projects in that funding bucket that they want to look at is drought resilience, is restoration projects, a lot of the ecosystem brownfields, that kind of work is where this funding is wanting to go. And so when we had an overview of that funding bucket and a brainstorming session in the last workshop, we took a poll, and some of the findings that we found are over here on the right hand of the slide. There was some energy and excitement around the nexus of water and energy efficiency. So some type of project that brings those two to light. There was excitement and energy about the opportunity to bring in the tribal community, and then partnerships with communities to then scale that model to other reaches. So I think this is really largely speaking to the Rio Reimagined work that's taking place, obviously right along the river, but then how do you take that model and then scale it even further to the further reaches? That's the context of that bullet point. And another funding bucket that we've been exploring is EVs, electric vehicles, a lot of energy around that, and a lot of money that is going to be able to be dispersed in that funding bucket. And so I just have a couple of the bullet points around that funding bucket. We know that DOT is working on the Arizona plan. That is the formula-based plan, and we are speaking more about the competitive money. So two separate pots of money. And in that conversation, there was, again, on the right-hand side, this is the poll, high-level results from the polls. Solar and storage exploration and low income areas. So finding the nexus of kind of resilience to the power grid, especially in low income areas, and what does that equity lens look like when we talk about the transition to EVs. Micro transit opportunities, private sector partnerships. We know that there's tons of private sector investment and location expansion happening in Arizona. And so taking opportunity of that. Funding and information sharing for regional planning. So those were just some of the things that we heard out of that larger conversation that we had on EVs. And again, if you missed those, there's recordings posted online. And so today we are going to be doing the same thing. We're going to be exploring the Healthy Streets funding bucket. And again, there's a lot of existing regional collaboration around these areas of works, these policy areas. There's a specific infrastructure funding program for this work. And really the conversation that we want to focus on today is how are we able to scale the existing work that's taking place and expand it to the regional level? What does that partnership look like? What does that scaling look like in terms of the workforce, equity, and of course, multi-city approach? Some of the call outs of programs that are mentioned in the Healthy Streets funding is heat island and cool pavement, air quality, flood through street infrastructure, so green stormwater infrastructure. And then of course, all of these proposals, all of this funding is going to be having a prioritization on low income, disadvantaged areas in the community. And we have not talked too much about that in these workshops yet. So we are going to continue to think through as we get closer to doing some joint grant submittals. Having that equity framework is going to be very important in how we develop a grant proposal. And so I'm sure some of you all have heard of President Biden's Justice 40 initiative, but we have here today Stacey Grant, who is going to speak about the Justice 40 a little bit more, that initiative, and I believe the accelerator it is called, that she is taking part in. So with that, I will turn it over to Stacy, and there will be a little of a bit of an opportunity to ask some questions right after she speaks. So with that, Stacy, I will turn it over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I am coming to you from cold 50-degree Michigan. So coming from the Great Lakes, and I'm just happy to be here. I wanted to speak about the Justice 40 initiative, about the Justice 40 initiative and the accelerator of which I'm a part of, and how this relates to the work that you're doing in Maricopa County and regionally in partnership with communities. And so just very briefly, a little bit about me. My name is Stacy Grant. I'm in Dearborn, Michigan, and I was serving as the Federal Resource Coordinator for the Highland Park Community Crisis Coalition. Highland Park is a small 3 square mile, very historic city that's inside the city of Detroit. And when the Justice 40 initiative was announced by Biden, we were looking for a place at the table to be able to access funding and to have engagement. And we found the accelerator, and we were able to apply for funding through the accelerator. And there was a position that opened that was called the navigator. And so Justice 40 navigators, of which I'm one of, and my co-navigator is Jamie Lewis. We engage with 52 frontline communities across 23 states to help them prepare for, apply for, and manage public funding, which includes federal funding. So I'll talk more about the accelerator in a little bit, but first I'd like to share more about exactly what the Justice 40 initiative is, and why it's so important in the conversation that we're having today. So it started with President Biden signing an executive order on last January called Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad, which created a whole of government mandate for the Justice 40 initiative. And what it specifically said is that 40% of certain federal climate investment benefits, those investments in these covered areas of climate change, clean energy and energy efficiency, transit, housing, workforce development, the remediation of legacy pollution and clean water would flow to disadvantaged communities. And so interlaced and inextricable to the Justice 40 initiative is equity, which I know that we're speaking about data and equity here. But I wanted to share one of our core partners, Partnership for Southern Equity, defines equity, both the agenda and the inequity lens. So the agenda being us working together to advance just outcomes that are sensitive to the needs and circumstances of populations in question, and working to erase barriers so that everybody can succeed. And so this is really a universal approach, but through a lens of equity. The question, of course, is how exactly is Justice 40 implemented and measured? And this is something that through the executive order and through interim guidance that each federal agency is crafting and designing its own approach on how to exactly measure and track what are these climate investments, how do we define benefits, and how do we define disadvantaged communities? And so each agency is charged to undertake this approach. So as an example, two important agencies that are a part of this conversation, the Department of Energy and Department of Transportation, both of them are using really an aggregation of several different data tools, but the EPA EJ screen being one of them. And then of course, for the Department of Energy, they're using their own lead tool. And for the Department of Transportation, they're looking at transportation disadvantage factors. And so they have a mapping tool that they're able to integrate with the EJ screen to determine exactly how they define these disadvantaged communities. Of course, this also means that states like Arizona are also defining, and you're a large part of driving this conversation in the agenda, is how then do states measure and track Justice 40? Because we know that so much of the federal dollars, both formula and competitive, will be flowing down to states. How do states adopt a Justice 40 framework? So for example, I was doing a little bit of research and know that your Department of Environmental Quality has this data tool that you're able to use in addition to any other EJ screens or federal tools that are available. The other thing that I wanted to offer is that the Brookings Institution has this federal infrastructure hub where it does track the infrastructure law funding and how it's being distributed across states. The other group, and of which I'm really proud to advocate for and to be in partnership with, are communities. And so, especially in frontline communities, the question is, how do frontline communities get to engage? How do we measure and also inform what are the benefits truly to underserved, systemically overburdened communities? And how are those investment benefits flowing? And because Justice 40 is a framework and not earmarked funding, it is not 40% of funding, but defined as benefits. And that requires that communities, or should require that communities, have not only a place at the table, but are able to speak very openly about what those investments look like and how they translate into true benefit and direct impact inside their communities. And this involves, of course, nonprofits and community groups that are working inside the communities. So as an example, two funding opportunities. One is through the Department of Energy called RACER. I wrote down what the acronym stands for, Renewables Advancing Community Energy Resilience. We have a couple of cohort organizations interested in this. And then funding opportunities that are flowing through the National Fish and Wildlife Federation. These are opportunities for funding where community involvement, frontline communities being part of that partnership, are imperative and very important. And so an example of how this regional kind of collaborative model between communities, regional offices, state offices, or local municipalities is critical for the success of these funding opportunities to really reflect Justice 40 values. The other resource I'd like to uplift is the People's Justice 40 Plus Community Benefit Playbook. It was curated by actually one of our cohort organizations that does fantastic work across the country, Emerald Cities Collaborative. And I will make sure to share this slideshow with everybody so that you can go through and have a copy and go through the links at your own leisure. The other just opportunity I would like to share is, if you're interested in Justice 40 data, particularly, here's a webinar that's coming up. One of our cohort organizations, Donnell Wilkins from the Green Door Initiative here in Detroit, will be speaking on a panel, but it's really a way for agencies, researchers, and the policy community to come together and really identify what the challenges and opportunities are around Justice 40 in data. Now I'd like to shift a little bit to talking specifically about what we're doing at the accelerator. If there's any, nuggets of wisdom, or if there's anything that we're doing that you might reflect upon and how you might integrate similar principles or programs within your city or across your region. Justice 40, I won't go through each of the organizations, but definitely invite you to take a look at our website and learn about our core partners and the 52 organizations that we're proud to support and partner with. And the accelerator, so I know that many of you are very familiar with the way that traditional accelerators work for startups and entrepreneurs, where you have seed funding and you have, a network of mentors and some preparation so that there can be capital investment and success for that startup. And so what happened is that when President Biden announced the executive order, 5 core team members, which were on that first page, came together because each one of those organizations has broad and deep and historic reach with frontline communities across the country, and knew that they needed to build the table for frontline communities to be able to understand, access, apply for, and manage Justice 40 funding. And so they created the Justice 40, really inspired by the initiative, but really loved in the beginning, Brianne, how you talked about this is really not just a moment, but a movement, and that we have to be thinking long-term, long arc. And the accelerator is no different. We're really hoping that this continues on because we know that frontline communities are going to continue to need support. So again, currently serving 52 frontline organizations. In this picture is Mama Shu in Highland Park. This is outside of her home workhouse, where she is installing green infrastructure, clean energy, running clean energy workforce development programs, and really providing several social service programs that the city is unable to afford to provide. Our accelerator, we like to think about it less as a framework and more as an experience that the communities go through and that we walk with them. And so we have, in the beginning, we offer $25,000 of unrestricted funding, very, very similar to many accelerators. And so it allows for several of these organizations to actually participate in our programming, because we know that many times the work or learning to do the work becomes the work. And so you have to stop the programming, you have to stop what you're doing inside of your communities to be able to build your organization. And so we offer seed funding. We are building what we hope to be an equitable and supportive community. So this means that we have a lot of opportunities for engagement and real relationship building across organizations that are all working on climate and investment, climate and environmental justice projects across the whole spectrum of issues, but are running into very similar barriers. And so just having that supportive community, I think is power building. The third thing is really doing very specific trainings, workshops, and then offering peer-to-peer learnings. We know that a lot of times organizations have answers to questions that other organizations have, and have that expertise. So we like to offer space so that they can share that wisdom and share their experiences and resources. We also do trainings around federal resource management, federal grant, basics for those who have never applied for federal funding. We all know how difficult and complicated that process is. And so you're talking about communities that are very under-resourced, often have very little full-time paid staff, or don't have a development director. And so we try to offer these trainings without cost to our communities. Building critical connections, funding and grant support, and generative impact. And so all of these really flow to the idea that we are trying to increase access and reduce and remove barriers, and doing it in a way that is very tactical and operational. And so one of the things that that has been an emergent learning for us is how important, and it's probably no surprise to all of you who are in this work deeply every day, that technical support and grant writing support is really critical to ensuring that frontline communities are able to either be part of an application or to be a lead applicant. And so one of the roles that I have, along with my co-navigator, Jamie, is listening to the projects, understanding where the funding opportunities are at the federal, through federal agencies, through state agencies, or even through foundations, and to be able to connect those resources, the technical assistance, the grant writers, and even the regional and local partners that can help come alongside the communities to support that application. And last year, this generative impact, we know that generational injustices are going to require generational solutions, that we cannot design or craft one sole solution, and that we're all really a part of the matrix. And so we're hoping to continue on a second cohort this summer, and hopefully far beyond that. So a few things, before I stop, I just wanted to offer a few ideas for action in Arizona, in Maricopa County, and regionally. And so this first one, of course, is very broad, and it's very aspirational, but it's really about how do we operationalize a working framework in Arizona, or how would you do that? How would you be able to incorporate the Justice 40 framework in your cities and in your region? One of the key piece of feedback that we've received, and you probably hear it a lot, is that communities learn about funding notices far too late. So as an example, the NIFWIF, there was one about coastal resilience that came out, that we had 3 organizations that really wanted to apply, that were positioned very well in the work that they do to apply. But they learned about the opportunity really 2 days before the application was due. And so what mechanisms does your city have? What mechanisms do you have in partnership to be able to track these funding notices and deploy them very quickly, deploy the information as quickly as possible to communities, really to everybody? I mean, I think that this is really a matter of how do we design inclusion. And many times with an equity framework, we're thinking about that the design for inclusion requires extra inertia towards including and reaching those that are most marginalized and hardest to reach. So it requires this, engaging agencies and building relationships, which I know that is preaching to the choir here. So I won't harp on that too much. I know that you're doing that very well, and that's exactly why you're having these conversations. And I really commend you all for that. Listening and learning from frontline communities so that they lead from the front. A lot of times there's engagement with frontline communities where they do get a seat at the table, but many times the power dynamic is one in which frontline communities and their leaders are sitting and listening, or not engaged with. And we're always advocating for not only a spot at the table, but a spot at the microphone, and to be able to be listened and heard. There's so many innovative solutions that these communities, I know in Arizona, so many of your tribal communities are holding these solutions. But just like any really amazing entrepreneur also needs support and structures to support their work. Convening these partnership opportunities, which I know that you're all doing, and allocating money specifically for technical assistance, grant writing, and your own version of what navigator support is. I know that the Department of Environmental Quality in Arizona has 6 community liaisons. So that's a start. And I think that each city could also have, or regionally, you can have this kind of navigator support to be able to do this cross-sectional reach. The last thing I would leave you with, and I have a slide just for some resources that I'll share. But the last thing that I would leave you with is to ask questions about barriers. And really it is what is visible to you that is not visible to me, or what's known to me that isn't known to you. That we each hold a piece of the solution. We're each a gatekeeper of information. We're each a gatekeeper of some kind of lived experience and expertise that might help to inform a policy, a program, and really open doors for others. And so in asking these questions, I think that we're really able to have a collective response that is aligned with the Justice 40 framework, justice, equity, and true repair in frontline communities, including in Maricopa County. My last slide here, well, my last two slides. So this is a list of resources that I just like to share. I will, of course, send this out to everybody so you have it. And then a last slide just with my email address, Jamie's email address, and our website. So I will stop there. I want to thank you so much for allowing me to, participate and be in the space with you this morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stacy, so much. I think that I learned a lot, and I feel like I've been pretty up to speed with a fair amount of this stuff, and the amount of data resources to that last slide of resources, and your action slide, or things that us as a region need to start to think about was very well done. So thank you so much. Just one point I want to make and let the group know your thoughts on designing a Justice 40 working framework for us, and what does that look like. I think that we are in the works of something like that. We have some partners in the community-based organization community that are collectively working on thinking about what that framework is to them, and then going to be sharing that with this group later on. So I wanted to let this group know that that is something that we are working on as part of this larger workshop series. And our friends at Unlimited Potential will be later coming in and sharing what those guiding principles are with all of us for our feedback and our thoughts and our consideration. So that is something that we plan to have in a later workshop, and something to definitely look forward to. And thank you so much for your context in the larger piece of why that is so critical and important. Does anybody have any other comments or questions for Stacy? The one question that I had, and it was in your slide of, I think, the 6 different tiles. On the second one, you said, we are seeing these 52 organizations and a wide spread of different projects that they have, but common barriers that they're running into. And I think you addressed some of those common barriers: technical expertise, grant writing, education and awareness of the opportunity were some of them. But is there any other ones that were not included in that slide that were loaded in that point that you made about it doesn't matter what type of project it is, there's some high level common barriers, or were those the high level ones, the kind of educational piece and the technical expertise ones?
Yeah, those two emerge to the top. And of course, we hear some very tactical feedback. One thing is that we have several of our organizations, probably close to a third of them, that are looking to renegotiate their indirect cost. That is something that, it's really the movement and equity. The practice of it is in the minutia, where high level theory, we can stay there, but when we really get into the details, and we see this in the accelerator, is that you have very, very tactical, very structural barriers that others in the community can come along and help with. So for example, there's an organization, one of our technical assistance providers is the Environmental Protection Network. It is, and I would share them with all of you, is that they're a network of about 550 volunteers, former EPA staff members and experts who really understand the federal funding landscape. So they come alongside of our organizations, and they can really help to troubleshoot some of these more direct and very specific barriers. And then, of course, we're looking at things that are more structural and systemic. But ways that people hold solutions to help organizations to address some of these more tactical barriers is as helpful as the structural ones as well.
Thank you for that so much. And so if nobody has any other questions, I think that going back to Stacy's kind of beginning portion of her presentation was that intersection of data and what does equitable data look like. We know that these grant proposals will need to include data, but not just kind of census data and what that looks like, but really that equitable framing. And so with that, I will pull up the presentation again and introduce the knowledge exchange for resilience. If you all have not heard of CUR, is what we call them for short. We are going to be getting a brief overview of some of the amazing work that they are doing that is absolutely the intersection of data and visualization, all framed in that equitable lens to be valuable to decision makers, to policymakers, to researchers. And so with that, I will hand it over to Patricia Solis, who will give a larger overview.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the opportunity to present some of our work, and so that we might be of service to this regional effort. So the Knowledge Exchange for Resilience is an entity, a mechanism, you could say, at Arizona State University. And you can see I'm in a energy efficient building here. My lights keep going off. We are supported by the Virginia G. Piper Trust. It began in 2018. And our work, really simply put, is around data and partnerships, and trying to make available the knowledge at Arizona State University in exchange with the knowledge and data and insights of the community, so that we can address some of these most pressing issues, the shocks, if you will, that we need to be resilient to. Heat is the threat multiplier that we most often rest with, and we have a very rich set of activities that we're trying to work through with cities, with nonprofits, and to some extent with the private sector as well. So we have a pretty good capacity with our in-house research team. We have some faculty. We have a cohort of students that often swells during the summer. And we have some signature projects. I just want to mention a couple of them that I think are the most relevant for these kind of broad sector, regional kinds of partnerships that we make ourselves available to the community. One of those is our fellowship program, which is a cohort model where we put in a year-long intensive process from 12 to 16 individuals, half of them from ASU and half of them from the community, ASU researchers and faculty, and people from organizations like community-based organizations, nonprofit cities have participated, county. And this process basically explores the idea of resilience, and each one of them have their own projects, but the combination and the synergies that we can create and the support that our team can give to those individual projects, I think, is a really great opportunity to think about really pulling off pieces of this kind of work. The other one that I wanted to mention is what we like to call designing for resilience dividends, where we like to work with multiple organizations and convene around the data and do what I call liberate data that maybe not be used normally for research, but we could visualize and put it into some sort of analytic framework and draw across all of the capacities at the university to really make sense of that, always driven by, in the first mile, by the questions from our community. So with that, I'd like for you to get a little deeper view of some of our work. And I believe I'm going to turn it over to our Associate Director for Resilience Hubs. That is Melissa Guardardo. She's going to talk first. We have a couple of our Associate Directors here today to go into deeper dive.
Thank you. I just want to state that Mason Matthews couldn't be here today, and I'm sure at the end we'll cover some of his work because his work is certainly fascinating as well. So I'm an urban heat researcher, really focused on equity, governance, policy, and resilience, and I'm especially interested in adaptive capacity, particularly for vulnerable groups. I really feel that adaptive capacity isn't realized through the current socioeconomic data, and there's probably something that has to do with social capital. And social capital, as you know, is so important in both empowering communities and also increasing capacities. And I'm just thrilled to hear about this Justice 40 frameworks, because I can think of 4 groups in the Valley that need to be a part of this as well. So I'm a qualitative researcher, and I hear stories of people. And as you know, data needs stories and stories need data. And one of the projects that, and I will put the link to this paper in the chat afterwards, but one of the projects that I did was to really do a deep dive and see how individuals are coping with heat. And what came out of this were 3 narratives. And just a brief overview of it is that there's one group where for them, heat is just an inconvenience. You know, they go from their air-conditioned house to their air-conditioned car to their air-conditioned office or school. Their life really isn't impacted at all. And what's important is that these are usually the decision makers. And then the next group, heat is a manageable problem. And these are the people who really manage everything. They manage their budget, they manage their exposure outdoors, they manage their thermostat like throughout the day and all different hours. And the last group was heat is really a catastrophe. We had the NIHHIS conference, and we heard these themes over and over again. And for that third group where heat is a catastrophe, they are just struggling to survive here. And they just have 2 bad choices to decide between. And it's that group that if we are talking about wanting to go in and assist, you have to be really aware of the challenges, heat, yes, but also the intersectionality of those issues. And my qualitative research also extends to the community. And we have this Heat Ready project that we have been working on at the city level. And I think Dave Handula will talk a little bit about this later. We are piloting the Heat Ready school idea. And this past year, we have really done most of the research to determine what a heat ready neighborhood is. And that this is a rubric that we developed through interviews and surveys and focus groups, where we came up with 4 key areas, and that's neighborhood cohesion, education activism, emergency preparedness, and physical landscape level interventions. But what was really interesting and kind of talks to this whole discussion we're having here is that initially we thought equity and inclusion would be another key point, but instead, people at the grassroots level really want to see that be the checklist for every action along the way. I work in the governance level with the Arizona Heat Resilience Working Group with many people who are on this call as well. And Richmond is the co-lead, Braden Kay, Dave Handula, and Paul Iniglis from the National Weather Service. We're all part of the steering committee for that. And there we're trying to gather governments, health departments, not-for-profits, the faith community to really get together and discuss best practices. So you can see in a regional resilience effort, certainly tapping into the strength of these networks would be great. We also have a cooling center working group where we have seen the magnificent power of community coming together. And this is a network to help provide more cooling opportunity. And so we've used data, and we have an optimization map where we take into account where there is need, where we have services already, and where we need to have more cooling centers and hydration stations. We also have a cooling center response network platform where cooling centers that need supplies can post, and it becomes a mutual aid society, a virtual mutual aid society. And the Arizona Faith Network has really stepped up to fill in some of our needs and holes along the way. And this has led to a discussion about resilience hubs. And perhaps all of these faith locations that have opened as cooling centers could be open year-round and really augment existing services and become resilience hubs, as well as the work that we did for the nature's cooling system, identifying heat action planning for grassroots communities. We have funding right now to develop a strategic plan in one of those neighborhoods to develop a resilience hub there. So you can see that I'm a qualitative researcher. I do a lot of community engagement, and I'm really adamant about having community talk about community perspectives as well. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Laura Phillips, who is going to talk about her area, which is slightly different from what I do.
Hi there. Good to see those who I know and get to meet those who I do not yet know. My name is Laura Phillips. I am an assistant research professor with the Knowledge Exchange for Resilience. And so my work does involve some climate questions, but a bit of it is climate adjacent. And so I'll just kind of go through some of what I do and think through the ways in which that relates back to the important work that you're doing here. So I would say, if I had to kind of summarize, an overarching theme of my work is this idea that exposure to shocks is uneven, and the consequences of experiencing those shocks work oftentimes to exacerbate existing inequalities. And so going back to what Melissa was talking about with her research, this would be those group of people for whom heat is a catastrophe, right? And so there is one particular group for whom that is true, and they are experiencing this shock. And so as it relates to climate specifically, probably the key piece of work that I've done in that regard is looking at mobile home residents and exploring why specifically mobile home residents are disproportionately likely to die from indoor heat exposure relative to people who live in other housing types. Other work that I've done under the umbrella of this idea of experiencing shocks includes kind of a potpourri of different things. So one of them was a paper that I'm working on currently that shows that engaging in precarious work, so work that is unstable, unpredictable, lacks protections in a variety of ways. So engaging in this type of work during one's late career is associated with a risk of poverty in later life, and also with racial and ethnic disparities in poverty in later life. I've also looked at county level economic insecurity, meaning declines in income, and have found that there are some regional trends therein. Some local Maricopa County based work that I've done in coordination with some of our community partners finds that certain classes of landlords are more likely to file evictions with the court system. And I also, working with a local partner, found that mobile food pantries, as opposed to brick and mortar pantries, increase food access for some of the most food insecure demographics. So really looking across a range of different topics, from housing to food to income to employment, with this overarching theme that exposure to shocks is uneven. So as it relates to the climate work that you all are doing, I would say that one important thing, in my opinion, obviously, because I study these topics and I think that they're very important. So I would say, keeping in mind when we are thinking about the larger context of climate, and particularly as it relates to individuals managing climate, managing the climate here in Arizona, we need to keep in mind that these other things are also happening adjacent to their climate management, right? And so I would argue that the people most likely to, for instance, be engaged in employment that is not quote unquote good employment, or who may have inconsistent work hours and therefore have a inconsistent income, or who are more likely to be facing these kind of housing challenges, are also the groups that are most likely to be struggling to manage their heat exposure or the climactic elements of their life. So, so this, I guess, also goes back to Melissa a bit with being as potentially lending itself to more of a qualitative approach, but just keeping in mind that people are experiencing these kind of co-occurring challenges, and that any solutions that we put into place have to kind of be aware that that is existing. So yeah, I think that is a bit about it for the very brief summary of work that I do. And it looks like Sarvaswar was able to join us, so I believe he is next. So I'll hop over to him. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Good morning, everybody. I am Sarvaswar, and I'm the Assistant Research Professor and Associate Director for Data and Visualization. So from the title, probably you get a sense of what I do. I try to bring together data, try to visualize them in a simplistic ways that communities can grasp with, that communities can derive, use for decision making. And over the last couple of years with KER, my work essentially falls into two different domains, and that's what is here on the slide. So first domain, it seems around environmental equity. So a bunch of work that I have done is on urban heat visualization. So you can see on the slide the links and also a visual where we have kind of looked at over 100 years of temperature data in Phoenix, Tempe, and Mesa, kind of understand where the deviation started, how is it going, and what can we do. Looking at also air quality sensors installing across Phoenix South, and we are mapping them around schools to understand exposure of the low-income communities and kids, to understand how air quality heat kind of disproportionately affects some of the more marginalized communities in some of the low-income neighborhoods. So kind of that intersectionality. And also, we recently been funded through the Walton Sustainability Service to look at community capital, where we're bringing together over 80 metrics. We're starting with Tempe, Scottsdale, and Phoenix. So we are bringing together a range of metrics to understand the equity score of communities. So, and where the community is lacking in which dimensions, so that can be taken up for influencing policies and channeling future investments. So that's the kind of work in the environmental equity side. And some of the links are already there on the slide for you to go in and look at those dashboards. In the limited time, I'm not able to demonstrate all of them. On the right-hand side, you see also a lot of my work falls into the economic security and especially the behavioral dynamics during pandemics. So we recently submitted a grant to NSF looking at modeling human behavior and how people make choices when going through a disaster. And that choices include a section of social distancing, how they follow the government guidelines, access to jobs, and how that impact mental health. And so bringing together all these different human dimensions into epidemic modeling. And recently we have also launched the poverty dashboard. Again, the link is on the website, built in collaboration with the United Ways. And that kind of also highlights the neighborhood scale granularity of who are the people who are struggling. And that's the map you are seeing on the right-hand side. Where are the families who struggle most, and families across race, ethnicity groups, male-headed, female-headed households. We look at a lot of these intersectionalities and details within these data sets. So there is also a dashboard we built on economic resilience that was specifically built during COVID to track how the job market is happening, what is the industries, how is the industries dealing with the hit from the pandemic. We track the unemployment insurance claims, we track the census household pulse survey data, the allocations to CARES Act. So giving out a bunch of data and visualizations for communities to understand the trends during the pandemics. And so now, also we looked at the human mobility patterns from the Google and Apple mobility data sets. We mapped out how the movements were happening and social distancing and observations, as I said, to government directives of school closures and so on. So I'm kind of now in a stage where we are taking into all of this multi-dimensional approach to epidemic modeling. And when I'm saying epidemic, it's not just COVID-19. I'm just writing a new grant with a couple of colleagues from mathematical departments. We're looking at mosquitoes impact from mosquitoes into, so that kind of pandemic aspect. So resilience at a different scales and bringing together all these poverty, jobs, data sets on how people moves through cities from their mobile smartphone data sets. So all of these are critical, valuable data sets that you can bridge together to understand and respond and build community resilience at different scales. So that's what I'm kind of working at, and I'll leave it here for the rest of the meeting. Thanks.
Thank you so much to the CUR team for providing an overview of the work that you're doing. I think that the human behavior work is super fascinating. Everybody, I think a majority of the audience is from the government sector and working in different government entities, and policies are put into place to control behavior, to shape behavior. And I think any type of modeling or better understanding of how the behavior reacts or is influenced is just incredibly fascinating, and something that I don't think we look into enough after a policy is put into place. And all of your work goes into that, right? So thank you so much. Before really opening it up to questions, I think I want to transition pretty quickly over, because there's such a great flow to the workshop today with the work that you all are doing in terms of the data in this space. And so we heard from Stacy about Justice 40 and how important that community-based approach is. We see that in your data, whether it be from working directly with the community and bubbling it up to then the larger visualizations and tools to help policymakers and decision makers. And then I think the last piece of this spectrum is then using that data to make those decisions to guide program and policy implementation. And that's, I think, what we want to hear from Dave Handula about, who has been able to do some of that specifically in this heat healthy streets kind of funding bucket area that I mentioned earlier. And so I want to kind of continue the conversation in the flow and then pause at the end and have more discussion about anything that you've heard from the CUR team and some of the work that they're doing, whether it be cooling centers, resilience hubs, the vulnerabilities of mobile homes, and to some of the concepts that Dave has been able to put into practice at the city of Phoenix or with some of his research, and how that relates to you and your organization. Do you see communities that are being impacted by this? Is there political conversations taking place in your organization on what are some mitigating practices that we can put into place? And do you think some of these concepts that we're talking about today can be scaled in a way that brings additional resources for a regional model? That's the frame that I want you all to be thinking of as we bring Dave forward to go over some of his work.
Well, good morning, everyone. Brianne, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you great.
Fantastic. And for those of you who can see me, good morning from the mobile studio here. I just completed a heat relief outreach shift in East Phoenix. But yeah, it's awesome to be on with you today. I'll save a little bandwidth and turn off the camera while we flip through the slides, then I'll be back on. But Brianne and Braden, so thankful for the chance to chat a little bit, and I feel a little uneasy sharing thoughts about using data to make decisions making, using data to help decision making after our outstanding colleagues from CUR. And I think a theme from their slides that will be my last slide as well is that we are in such a data and analytically rich region that I think we can be really mindful and strategic about how we're making some of these investments, whether it's in the Healthy Streets bucket or elsewhere. And without speaking for Melissa, Patricia, and Laura and the CUR team, I've always felt like there's a tremendous appetite from the university to try to work on real problems that cities are making. And I think we're still learning how to make that ask and provide those answers. And I think this Healthy Streets bucket will be a really fun one to play in there. Okay, so I'm obligated, since the topic was about vulnerable populations, I'm obligated with my academic roots to bother us with a definition slide and a conceptual framework. One of the definitions, so I think we need to set the stage. What do we mean, vulnerable populations? This is one of the definitions that gets thrown around in the academic literature about likelihood of experiencing harm. And there are all sorts, if we go to the next slide, Brianne, there are all sorts of diagrams in the academic literature to help us understand what this might mean for particular hazards, including heat. This is one of the diagrams that has been put forward in the literature, conceptual frameworks related to heat vulnerability. And some researchers and practitioners, for that matter, are focusing on very particular parts of this diagram. And I think it is not the worst use of our time to try to situate some of our programs and conversations as in a conceptual framework like this one, whether it's this particular one or not. Just for quick orientation, all of the blue elements in the middle are hypothesized to in some way contribute to vulnerability, or we could imagine maybe a slight reorientation of this contributing to resilience or risk, and folks get very sensitive about the definitions and use of those words, and I'm glossing over it right now. Those all have an impact on the red box, heat-related mortality and morbidity in the case of this diagram. Although I think, and I'll show an example here, we need to expand our concept of that red box to include quality of life, perception of our region from outside investors, walkability, et cetera. I think that red box can be a lot bigger. And then hopefully we're doing a lot of work in that orange box, the strategies that influence vulnerability and ultimately reduce risk. As we go on to the next slide, just wanted to remind all of us that in some ways, I would argue that we are swimming in vulnerability analyses here in Maricopa County. Now, maybe they don't exactly exist for each of our jurisdictions. Maybe they're a little outdated, but in terms of an off-the-shelf product, some representation of vulnerability at what could be argued to be a neighborhood scale, there might be 10 of those that exist in one form or another already. So I hope we could save a step in our workflow if we need what I'll call a crude off-the-shelf assessment of vulnerability. I'm sure my ASU colleagues are happy to help all of us source some of them and interpret what they mean. One of the most cited in the academic literature is this one on the left from Sharon Harlan. The colors in the background are some type of vulnerability index, some effort to quantify all of those different factors we saw on the previous slide. And the one on the right is the same, different researcher, different spatial scale, as you can see, but all to suggest we have a lot of these maps in circulation. And on the next slide, we also have non-maps in circulation that are really helpful for understanding where risks are highest in the community. This is a screenshot right out of the County Health Department annual heat mortality report, which for those of us working on the heat, I think is an annual must read. And this shows how the rate of heat-associated death varies by different demographic groups based on identity here. It shows us two groups that are particularly high risk of heat-associated death, Black African American and American Indian. And also we see, and this is a pattern that occurs in the Maricopa County report almost every year, folks who are identified as Hispanic in the reporting process actually have a lower rate of heat-associated death than those who are identified as white non-Hispanic. And I think the question, and we don't have time to get into today, what's happening in those communities that's actually reducing the risk of heat-associated death? That's important research, some of which has been done, more of which needs to be done. If we move on to the next slide. So the next slides are a few of my observations / complaints about where the state of vulnerability analyses and mapping are. And I put these few slides together because there have been a few papers that have come out in recent years that suggest that the academic community, and I'll share in the blame here, has kind of missed the target in these vulnerability analyses, particularly concerning decision making. I think many of us imagine that we're going to conduct a vulnerability analysis, make an index, make a map, hand it off to Brianne, and it's going to change her life and the way she's spending her money and operates her programs. But there have been a number of papers that have directly said, we're not sure that's happening, and or the way the analysis has come out might not actually be reflecting risk in the community. For example, a Phoenix study showed that of the census tracts that are identified as, quote, highly vulnerable, only about half of them were census tracts that actually had a high rate of heat-associated illness. And some other survey research that my colleague Lance Watkins has done reached similar conclusions with other survey-derived measures of where people are really struggling with heat in the community. Those weren't always the places that were identified by a, quote, off-the-shelf vulnerability index. So one of the challenges I think we have is that the outcome that we're focused on is not always very clearly thought about when we're creating an index. I would argue if we're trying to prevent heat-associated deaths, that calls for a different framework, a different set of variables than if we're trying to improve neighborhood walkability. And thus, I think it's happened too many times when we've handed a decision maker a vulnerability map to help solve problem A, but the vulnerability map might have really been made to solve problem B or an undefined problem. And I think we can do better there. On the next slide, I think we haven't always supported particular decision makers. I think we've created maps with the hope that they will be useful for some decision, but not thought about what those decisions are. And then when it comes time to make a decision, the decision scale that we have, like picking a particular street segment, that'll be the example I jump to here in a moment, it doesn't actually work in the scale of the analysis that has been done. We have polygons, we have census tracts, and we need to pick individual lines on the map. Or maybe there's a mismatch of the time scale as well. I think I think we can get more specific in the way we're conducting these analyses. And then on the next slide, Brianne, my third and final complaint here. I mean, this appears all over the academic literature, but have we adapted our analysis to the local context? Has any community provided input on this, or are we just copying a recipe that was, came out of a CDC report and making a Phoenix version of that? Maybe we can do better with a little bit more local information that goes into these analyses. And what are we doing to validate these analyses? As I suggested before, a couple of the validation type exercises have yielded what I would almost call scary results. And if the vulnerability analysis itself is matching the outcomes that we claim to be concerned about. So I mean, these are all self-criticisms as much as they are criticisms of any of my peers, but are certainly points that have really resonated with me in the first 6 months on the job with the city. So Brianna, as we go to the next slide, I wanted to share just a little bit of how we're trying to do a touch better in thinking about using, quote, vulnerability data, and I'm defining that really broadly here, to help with a particular decision. So some of you might be aware that City of Phoenix has added to its budget for tree planting along street segments in what we're calling our Cool Corridors program. Pardon me for just a second. So the outcome of concern for this this investment is that we are seeing pedestrians who are too uncomfortable and too hot, or we're not seeing pedestrians where we'd hope to see them in pursuit of some of our active transportation goals. And we get the tie into healthy streets here. The specific decision we're supporting is which public right-of-way should we choose for tree planting. There are thousands and thousands of miles of streets in the city of Phoenix. We have a confined budget for this project. So how do we pick which ones to prioritize in the early stages of this tree planting initiative? Next slide, please, Brianne. So I'm sorry, this is not the world's most beautiful diagram, but just wanted to give a sense of some of the steps in our process. And then I'll show you a screenshot of what the resulting tool looks like that we developed to support this specific decision. So the rumors that this investment was forthcoming started bubbling up last spring, about 14 months ago. And as those rumors were bubbling up, our public advisory board that deals with matters for heat and shade in the city, our Urban Heat Island Tree Shade Subcommittee, wrote a memo to the city with recommendations for how to design and implement the Cool Corridor program. And it had it identified a number of variables or factors that should be considered when selecting street segments for this investment. Those of us on the ASU team saw that memo, listened to that conversation, and did our best to gather the data sets that matched the factors that the advisory board thought were important, and slammed them all together in some sort of prioritization tool. We will not worry about the math today, but you can imagine mixing all these variables together to come up with a score, and a score for every street segment in the city, in this case, the major arterial streets. But I mean, a key step in that process, and this I was talking about before, we had to start from scratch, or essentially start from scratch, in defining the geography for the problem. If the goal is to pick street segments, well, and 1 mile street segments, well, let's be sure we create a universe of street segments to work from as our decision-making environment, rather than a zip code map or a census tract map. We presented a first version of the tool to that Urban Heat Island Tree Shade subcommittee, got a little bit of feedback, continued to make some tweaks, and then ultimately shared that tool with our streets department, who holds the budget and is going to be implementing this particular program. They fed that tool into a larger suite of factors that were involved, that they needed to think about in making recommendations to city council offices. They offered each city council office a menu of options that met not only the goals of the prioritization tool, but some other factors, including, very importantly, where there is public right-of-way for tree planting. Council offices adopted different strategies for vetting those lists, and came back to the streets department with a choice. And tree planting is underway, even today, for this particular program. This is not the best life cycle for community engagement. There are a number of places in here where I think we could, and we will in future years, inject more direct public dialogue. But there's a start here. And I think you can see a couple of places where a public perspective is included, and where the researchers are tweaking their workflow to address the specific decision that needs to be made. As we move ahead, Brianne, just a couple of the details here to clarify from the workflow there. For this particular program, the spatial unit we needed to think about were 1 mile segments of arterial roads. And there's not a layer that we can download right now that is 1 mile segments of arterial roads in Phoenix. So my teammate Lance did awesome work there, divide that arterial road network up into 1 mile segments. Variables that we heard were important from the Urban Heat Island Tree Shade Subcommittee included: where are pedestrians in the city? Where are people using transit? Where don't people have cars? Where is there shade and trees in the city? Where is it hot in the city? And some of the variables that in some cases are in the index, in some cases are not in the prioritization index, but are thought about later in the workflow. Where is there public right-of-way? Where do we need to work around utilities? We only have so much money to spend. And for this particular program, it was determined that there would be investment evenly across all city council districts. So not only do we need to identify the quote most in need street segments in the city, but we need to find the most in need ones within each of Phoenix's 8 city council districts. As we move ahead, Brianne, and that's an interesting decision from an equity standpoint, of course, the idea that we need to have some, we need to be doing a cool corridor in each city council district. Right now, I think we're okay in that there are very high need segments in each city council district, but at some point, we're gonna run out of high need ones in some districts faster than others, and that'll be an interesting point in our decision making. So here's what the map looks like. It is not beautiful. It is not meant for public consumption. It could be. There's no reason it couldn't be. But this was really meant to be viewed by a very small audience of folks involved in the decision-making chain inside City Hall. Just to draw your attention to a couple of features, all of the brighter line segments you can see where there's kind of a bolder, brighter purple or yellow or green or blue, those are the segments that emerged from the algorithm that tried to reflect what the advisory board told us. So those are the prioritized segments. There are 10 in each of the city council districts. And then clicking on a street segment, there are a wide range of metrics available one can view to understand why it was or was not recommended as a priority. With about 10 minutes of training, we could all understand what these metrics are, but it's not important for our discussion today. But just wanted to show you a little bit of what the tool looks like. It's kind of a ugly under the hood tool. But we have found it. We find ourselves repeatedly going back to it to understand where might other options be, or where can we align in investments. Just to wrap up here, to echo this point that I think, although I don't know if my career colleagues intentionally were making it, I think they made it very well. We are super rich regionally in terms of heat data. Not perfect. We don't have everything we want, and we got great people working on filling in some of those gaps. But I think as we're contemplating how to improve our decision making with data, we can be really broad in interpreting what we mean by data, both traditional kind of numerical data like heat illness and death data, like temperature data, but also some of the other types of data sets we heard about from Kerr, including data that emerge from narratives, storytelling, from local heat action planning processes. And maybe there's some creative opportunities using 211 and 311 call data, looking at real estate listings. I'm sure the list is much longer than what's on this slide here, but just wanted to offer an initial potpourri to remind all of us that we have a great starting point, such that we can be specific, we can be tailored, we can be custom in designing tools that support all of the different decisions that we'll be making, including those in the Healthy Streets bucket. So I think that's a sufficient ramble for me. I hope a little bit of that might have been useful, and Brianne and Braden and others, thanks for the chance to share.
Thank you so much, David. We appreciate it. I think it's a really good example of the infrastructure investment as it relates to a very specific program funding bucket from the federal funds. And I'm curious from the group to know how much this resonates with you in your own communities. I think a lot of our communities have similar types of healthy streets initiatives, whether it's cool corridors or a tree canopy goal, an urban forestry plan. I know that the city of Goodyear and Peoria and some others were on. Do you all have some of these plans of shade coverage, of cooling corridors? Is there any initiatives that you all have currently going on or to be talked about that this group can collectively think on and build upon, and take the examples from Dave's work and take the data from Kerr to scale this conversation to a regional level?
Brianne, let me also interject while folks are, their minds are turning. There are more resources coming to help us develop tools like these at the regional scale, and that includes work with American Forests, who is part of our Urban Forestry Roundtable. Some of you, will recognize their participation, but they're really interested to help us build some new tools for tree and other heat investment prioritization, what they call their tree equity score analyzer. They're ready to build it for the region. ASU has stepped up to match some funding, and American Forests is insistent, as are we, that this be a regional tool, that it supports decisions in Avondale just as much as it does in Phoenix. How we build it, exactly how it works, that's a conversation we need to have in the next year, but there is funding available to have that conversation and include not only this group, but other important stakeholders.
Oh, that's great. Thanks.
So I don't think we need to be shy in dreaming here of how we can build more tools.
Yeah, and I think that, sometimes, say a city doesn't have a specific tree shade cooling goal, but when you hear elected officials talk about, oh, well, I want my city to be more walkable, or the downtown needs to be more walkable, that is cooling goals, that is shade goals. So I guess I challenge some of the folks on the call today to be aware of some of those comments and those thoughts that you're hearing from the elected officials, and take that as an opportunity to engage in this conversation. I really see Healthy Streets as hitting a lot of goals for different municipalities, and really see a collective, as Dave mentioned, as we heard from Kerr, there's a good amount of resources available. There's good data available. We have some great experts available to us in this space, and how can we as a region join together in this conversation to bring some funding for impactful infrastructure for our communities. We only have about 5 minutes, but I wanted to pull up the poll questions. They're very similar to the ones that we've done the last time. I think it's helpful for us to just kind of see what your thoughts are on the conversation of the healthy streets, and see if we should continue to kind of go down this path. if your organization feels like they're of interest in this space. So Anne, if you don't mind putting the questions forward. There's the first two are multiple choice, and the last one is open-ended.
Brianne, not to bias the audience in answering this question, but I think it's shown on your slide very nicely. Our interpretation, and I think yours as well, is that this Healthy Streets program really has a wide concept of what healthy could mean, and it could mean trees, it could mean reflective pavement, it could mean benches, it could mean speed control measures.
That's right.
So although I talked about trees and the picture shows cool pavement, I think there are a lot of directions that could bring people to the table.
That's right. For instance, the city of Tempe is working on investing shade covers for all of our bus stops, right? It's a pretty typical infrastructure investment, but something that our city has identified as something that meets our community's needs, and those who are using public transportation, and our council has made it a priority. So it's a more traditional type of infrastructure, but definitely something that advances our goals. All right, it looks like folks are wrapping up on the poll, and it looks like, to the first question, do you think there's potential for your organization to join in a joint application for this? Yes, it looks like there's majority of people that's saying it's right up our alley. Did the discussion around heat vulnerability bring to light potential projects, partnerships you have not thought of? Some good brainstorming, some of the same discussions. I can't see the last five. The 5 words or last one, but happy to share that going forward. That brings us to our end of the workshop today. We will be having the next one on May 17th. So same timing, Tuesday, 8:30 to about 10:30. We will continue to explore what that community-based partnerships approach looks like. So diving a little bit deeper into some of what we heard from Stacy. And I would say be on the lookout for an invitation to participate in a more tangible conversation about funding proposals. I would say both in the green infrastructure, healthy street space, and electric vehicles. I think that those are kind of the 2 areas where we see the most energy and engagement from this community. And so getting a little bit more tangible with what a grant proposal looks like is the next steps as we continue this grant series for higher level, bringing in folks at the national level, similar to what we had with Stacy, and providing us some insight on tips, tricks, technical expertise in the areas that we are interested in. So both the larger workshop and then an invitation to participate in some of the more tangible work on grants.
There were a couple questions in the chat. Specifically, one was for Dave with regards to if the tool that he mentioned was open to the public. I'm not sure that question got
we can
answered.
share it. As I mentioned, it's not meant to be, it wasn't really designed to be friendly for public consumption, but yeah, it's out there on ARC Online and not locked down. So folks can get to it, and yeah, we'd love to hear feedback. And if there's any interest to build a nicer one, we can do that. We, meaning you, of course, could build it.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to ask any final questions if we missed any of them in the chat, because there were some great comments put forth as well.
Leanne and Anne, if I can just share a quick reflection. So I think this has been so valuable to kind of go through this, look at how data can be used to supplement this work. And I think it was really neat to see Dave kind of point out that there can be some errors in relying on the data. I remember this, I had an amazing professor who shared with me this book that was called How to Lie with Maps. And it wasn't intended to teach anybody how to lie with maps, such as ones that we're looking at, but it's understanding that there are lots of different ways for data to be perceived and sorted and shown. And even in, I really like, Dave, how you walked us through that process, but even thinking about it, the streets crew kind of limited and say, okay, we're only going to do this in areas where we can physically put in trees in the right of way. And I know we were going through a similar process in Avondale. And as we're driving through the streets, recognizing that where there is sufficient right of ways is typically our newer neighborhoods. And so if we continue down our same pathway, we were going to be eliminating older neighborhoods that really were where our most heat vulnerable communities lived. And so it's like, gets me thinking, if we are lucky to get some funding for this, maybe we need to direct more of it, even though there's more barriers and more challenges with figuring out how to get these trees where they really are needed most. Maybe that's something that we need to consider. And the last thing I was thinking is kind of the other neat way that you could empower and bring community into this data sharing atmosphere is say, okay, we've got this maps, sit down with the community that's lived there, the longer the better. If they have generational knowledge, that's so invaluable. And they can really say, okay, well, your map sucks because XYZ. And so being able to show the data to residents, but listen and find out, like, is this actually an accurate reflection, could be a kind of a neat way to empower residents with that knowledge, but also improve the data tools to be more accurate at the local level. So that's kind of what I'm wrapping my head around right now, but I'm so thankful for everybody that came and shared these insights. And now I'm going to be like looking back over the information and chewing on everything.
And I hope you know that your comments landed you a position on the Phoenix Cool Corridor Advisory Board. So thank you for that reflection. I think your points were well taken. Well, with that, I will say goodbye to all, and please put May 17th on your calendars. We'll be providing some examples for community-based partnerships, what some of the best practices look like, and then try to bring those examples to spark some ideas on how we can do that within the funding buckets that we've identified today. So thank you all so much for your participation. If you have any questions or thoughts afterwards, feel free to reach out to me or Anne.
Thanks, Brianne. Thanks, Anne.
Thanks, Dave, so much.
Thank you.